Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Lydia Wilson, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. We're recording this episode in the aftermath of America's midterm elections, the first nationwide election since the January 6th Capitol attacks. They came at the end of what had already been a politically turbulent year. In June, the Conservative-controlled Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade, the 1973 ruling which guaranteed the right to abortion. In August, the FBI raided former President Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida. And in October, Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked in their home with a hammer in a botched attempt to kidnap her. Prominent Republicans questioned whether the assault even happened. In a typical year, we are not often faced with the question of whether the vote we cast will preserve democracy or put it at risk, said Joe Biden. But this year, we are. The final result has yet to be decided at the time of recording, but some things have already become clear. Despite predictions that Republican revanchism would lead to a red wave, the GOP have failed to unseat many of the Democrat incumbents they hoped to. For their part, the Democrats won crucial victories in Pennsylvania and Kansas, but may still lose control of the Senate if the Republicans win in Arizona, Nevada, or Georgia. Both parties believe that their America is at stake. I'm joined today by Robert Evans, a journalist and podcaster. He's reported from conflict zones abroad, but in more recent years, his work has focused on extremist groups in the United States, and in particular, the city of Portland, which has seen repeated street battles with the far right over the past 2 years. In 2019, he began his ongoing podcast, It Could Happen Here, by examining the possibility of a second American Civil War. Robert, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lydia.
So, Robert, how are you doing? You were up late watching the results come in, so let's start there. This isn't what most pundits were predicting, right? Conventional wisdom had this as a Republican sweep, but that's not what we're looking at, is it?
No, and the conventional wisdom was pretty safe in that it's nearly always in American midterm elections, the sitting president's party loses a significant number of seats in both the House and Senate. That happens pretty close to 100% of the time. The last time we had a midterm election that went this well for the party that was in the White House was 2002, in the immediate wake of September 11th. And then obviously people kind of lost their minds a little bit over that. But so this is a noteworthy shift from normal. If you kind of look at what a lot of pundits were saying prior to this, there was a lot of talk about how Democrats had gone too far in backing progressive policies. They supported, defunding the police too much. They'd gone in on student loan debt forgiveness, and all of these things were mistakes. And I do think one of the really clear kind of clarion calls from these results, as we know them right now on the day after the election on November 9th at roughly 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, is that those pundits were very wrong. Progressive candidates did quite well, whereas conservative Democrats struggled. You had a couple of former police officers running in Florida as Democrats who failed. You had the candidates in a couple of other states. The guy who was running against J.D. Vance come out against Biden's student loan debt or student loan forgiveness proposal. Whenever you've had kind of Dems go what we used to call the blue dog route, which is kind of Democrats that are much more conservative and do things like turn against Biden on student loan forgiveness or do things like really leaning hard on the police, you've seen those candidates underperform, as opposed to folks like John Fetterman, who is a pretty unapologetic progressive, has done extremely well. And you're seeing, we had a massive upset, and this is one I think isn't getting as much national attention yet. In Los Angeles County, the sheriff is a guy, Alex Villanueva, who exercised a tremendous amount of power over one of the most corrupt police departments in the country. And 6 months ago, probably everyone would have said was a lock for re-election. And not only did he lose badly, but a ballot measure passed that's going to make it possible for, I believe it's the City Council of Los Angeles, to fire sheriffs in the future. So I think one of the things you've seen from this is that kind of the pundit wisdom that a lot of these progressive policies are death electorally it does not appear to be holding true in light of everything that's happened.
So what accounts for that then? What were the pundits actually missing? You think that they were missing the popularity of the progressive issues?
I think that is part of it. I think things like one thing that you saw tonight is the Democratic Party last night, is the Democratic Party got heavily rescued by young voters, not just millennials, but a lot of Gen Z voters. And those people were turning out, I think the polling suggests, turning out heavily to protect their right to things like reproductive freedom. This was I think some of the story is that this was about the fact that a number of candidates ran on progressive campaigns and that was popular. But I think a huge part of the story, and maybe the biggest part of it, is that a lot of voters came out because they were scared as hell of the things that the GOP has been doing and saying lately. The Republicans made a choice to embrace a lot of the most radical candidates, people like Boebert, people like Kerry Lake, who were saying some horrifying things, not just about the future of reproductive freedom, but about the role Christianity ought to have in our society, about LGBTQ people and what kind of rights they should have. The Tennessee, after a night in which the state voted very progressively in a lot of ways, the Republicans are trying to push a ballot measure to criminalize drag events, essentially. Which if they'd won last night would seem like kind of more of a frightening step towards authoritarianism. But given their failures to lock in power in that state, just kind of seems like spitefulness now. And I think a lot of why that red wave never materialized is that, and this was something, I was just talking about, I think the pundits made some mistakes in thinking that a lot of these progressive policies were less popular than they are. The thing that we couldn't have known was the degree to which voters were going to react against the power grabs that the right has made. And I'm happy to say that it does look like that's one of the stories from last night.
Oh, so do you think this was actually a referendum on Trump in a way?
I don't know that I'd say, because I think 2020 was the referendum on Trump, right? I think this is kind of a little broader. I think it's a referendum on what Trumpism has brought to the party. What you've seen in the Republican Party, and this has been occurring for years, actually, ever since particularly the Tea Party, but this really accelerated under Trump, is you can't get elected, or it's a lot harder to get not elected. It's a lot harder to win a political primary as a conservative in the United States, as a Republican, without leaning into that. I don't know what else to call them, but like the fascist wing of the party, right? To attack trans people, to attack gay people, to propose these nightmare laws, to, do things like pose with a gun and talk about, like Eamon Bundy did in Idaho in his race, kicking Democrats out of the state, all that kind of shit. Sorry, all that kind of stuff. I think that has become, like, because of how popular this chunk of the Republican Party is, it's become the easiest way to win primaries, right? Is by leaning into the most extreme wing of the party. And I think what this election was a referendum on Americans saying, well, then we're not going to vote for Republicans. If those are the people you're going to put forward, we're just not going to vote for them because, we may not actually be as progressive as maybe some of these results would suggest. But we prefer that to what we're being handed with these people who are getting up and talking about how every election is stolen and, putting out some of the most like unsettling rhetoric in the entire history of American politics, which is filled with some pretty messed up rhetoric. I think that's what this is a referendum against.
Well, if we kind of jump forward to 2024, I mean, it is worth pointing out that the Republicans did have an exceptionally strong showing in Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis beat his opponent decisively, even in areas which have traditionally swung Democrat. And of course, DeSantis has made no secret of his designs on the presidency.
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised to see that. I would have been shocked to see anything happen to DeSantis or to happen to Greg Abbott, who's the governor in Texas, who beat Beto O'Rourke by 28% or so. because those states have been very good at, number one, those states have been Republican strongholds for a while. Texas longer than Florida. Florida was once a swing state. There's a longer conversation to be had about like why particularly places like Miami went so red. I think the lockdowns have a lot to do with it. I think the industries that traditionally sustained Florida and how they were impacted by those lockdowns have a lot to do with it. I think the fact that DeSantis did stuff like go out after felons who were presumably supposed to be allowed to vote, and arrest people on the basis of kind of like very minor issues with their ballots that were technically in violation. Like there was a bit of a fear mongering campaign by the DeSantis campaign and quite a lot of cracking down on voting, because that's, what the Republicans do when they have unquestioned power. Now, I don't know if I think that's the majority of the reason why Florida went so hard red. I think Florida went so hard red because Ron DeSantis is a competent authoritarian, and very effectively built a base of power and has made it pretty much impossible to run successfully as a Democrat. Now, I don't think that's all on DeSantis. I think the Florida Democratic Party is not a particularly competent Democratic Party either, which is the issue with a lot of state Democratic parties, by the way. But I don't think anyone who has lived in the South is surprised by that. And I'm not surprised by what happened in Texas. I think Democrats have largely been mistaken in hitching so much hope on Beto O'Rourke. He's a very charismatic guy. He's good at building, a following. He's good at getting donations. He's a decent organizer. He responded pretty effectively to the horrible snow disaster that we had in Dallas about 2 years ago. I respected him for that, but he's a bad political candidate. This is his third major election that he's lost and just ignited tens of millions of dollars. And by the way, the same is true of Stacey Abrams, who's wonderfully talented in a number of things and who did a lot of great work in getting people registered, and is a big part of why Florida went blue in why Georgia went blue in 2020, but is not a great candidate. And Beto in particular is not a great candidate because he does not understand how you actually reach out to independents in Texas. The Dems are never going to win just on campaigning to Dems. And when you're doing stuff like talking about confiscating AR-15s, again, this is something that people outside of the U.S. and even outside of Texas, because a lot of Americans don't understand it, don't get, but like, you are not going to win independence in Texas by going after guns. It's even after Uvalde. Again, I get it. Like, I'm not making an argument about whether or not this is a good way for things to be. I grew up in Texas. I lived there for 20 years. It's the way the state is. And I'm not surprised that some of these red areas held, in particular because the people, the authoritarians who are running them, Abbott and DeSantis, know what they're doing. They're very intelligent guys. They're good at maintaining power.
Well, then, do you think we're going to see both of them on the ballots for the primaries?
I'd be shocked if Abbott ran. We might see him as a candidate for a little while, but I don't know. I would be very surprised if he actually made a serious attempt at the presidency. DeSantis, sure. At some point, we're going to see DeSantis run for president. Unless he gets like hit by a bus or something, I can't imagine him not trying for that. It seems as if he's building his entire career towards that.
Well, some people might be tempted to celebrate if he managed to usurp Trump, but he's a creature of Trumpism, no?
I think he has taken advantage of Trumpism. I think he has used it to his own ends to enable his rise to power. I do think he's his own kind of authoritarian. I think that's actually one of the things most worth paying attention to with DeSantis, is that while he certainly understands the value of being allied with Trump and being allied with the Trumpist wing of the party, because it's the most activist wing, it's where the momentum is. I don't think he's a Trumpist. I think he's DeSantist, I guess, is what you'd call it. But he is, I think this is what's unique about him, because the Republican Party has become filled since Trump's success with so many people who are nothing but creatures of Trump, creatures of Trumpism, riding its coattails. DeSantis is his own kind of politician and his own man.
Can you characterize when you say a different type of authoritarian?
Yeah, DeSantis is much more cut from the mold of a guy like Viktor Orban, right? He is more methodical. He is more careful. He is less showy. He is less about, although he does, uses populism for his own ends. Trump almost entirely exists within that populist sphere, right? You can see the man deflate when he has to do anything that isn't like get out in front of a crowd. That's what he likes to be doing, and that's how he's built his power. DeSantis has used populist rhetoric and propaganda in order to kind of further his base of power, but he fundamentally works through the political system and extends power through the political system, and cracks down on any attempt at resistance through the political system in a way that is, again, very methodical and effective, as opposed to Trump it was a lot lazier about that sort of thing, right? And as much, January 6th is the kind of attempt at taking power you get from a man like Trump. It's very slapdash. It's very kind of like, it did not originate from within the power structure in a way that is significant. And I think DeSantis is a guy who is most comfortable sitting within the power structure and letting it become a part of him. Like that's the way the man works.
Well, on the subject of January the 6th, I was quite struck by how much of the coverage was still very much stuck in horse race mode, where it's all about the minutiae of poll numbers and projections, and not so much about what was actually at stake or how dangerous a moment it might actually be. Election officials have been threatened, candidates have been attacked, people with firearms have been showing up to so-called monitor polling stations in full tactical gear. Now, as someone who's reported extensively on the rise of political violence, how concerned were you that this would be a flashpoint for another wave of it?
I mean, it looks like, and we're still trying to get a handle on exactly what happened yesterday and what places there were political violence, but there was political violence that occurred in and around the midterm elections. In addition to the stuff you kind of like started the episode noting a few things. There was a very troubling story in Pennsylvania of a man who was killed by his neighbor, and the deceased man's wife says that it was a result of the fact that the neighbor thought he was a Democrat. Like you've gotten a couple. Oh, sorry, this was Ohio.
That's terrible.
And then you had. Yeah, and I think we're still kind of waiting to find out more about that case. But it was certainly an unsettling one. And then there were a couple of cases of targeting and polling sites in New Orleans. There was a bomb threat that caused a polling place to be moved from one school to another, like it had to change locations as a result of a bomb threat. There were reports of on the street, like poll watchers, kind of like the folks you talked about, intimidating people in North Carolina, Arizona, and Texas. More cases of people with guns outside of polling places in Ohio. At a where's West Bend? So I'm pulling up some of the things that I was saving last night.
Practically everywhere. I mean, you're just spanning the country.
I mean, it's a big country, right? These are still. This is not most polling places. Certainly, the vast majority of voters would have gone to the polls without seeing something like this. But it's certainly more widespread than we've seen. Most elections in my lifetime, 2020 being accepted, and it's troubling. It's part of a troubling trend. I think it's easier now. I think if last night had gone down the big wave for the Republicans, I might have seen this, the intimidation we saw last night, as kind of evidence more of how this sort of authoritarian moment is getting more powerful in U.S. politics. I guess it's possible. And after the last couple of years, I hesitate to be too optimistic, but it's possible, given the fact that this certainly doesn't seem to have stopped people from voting, and that the folks, intimidating people, their side generally performed below expectations. You might say that this is a sign that kind of behavior, that kind of violence, is part of what did them in, and what we saw yesterday may be the downswing of it. I don't know that I think that. I'm still very worried about how hot the temperature has gotten and how deeply angry American politics still is.
So do you think when we look back at this election, we're going to see it as a turning point?
That's very hard to say because, for one thing, midterms are midterms. One thing that is worth noting is that, like, while midterm elections are often crucial in a lot of ways in terms of like what kind of stuff gets passed as the result of one side, taking over another or being able to lock down the presidency and gridlock, they often don't change the overall swing of elections, right? You've seen Clinton and Obama both had disastrous midterms and got reelected. It's not a guarantee that it will, but also like, in 2018, Trump had a midterm that was like a normal level of bad for the party in power and lost reelection. So I don't know. I don't know if I think. I guess fundamentally, if you're asking about like, what does this mean about the broader state of violence in American politics and violent rhetoric in American politics? One thing it does mean is that so far up to this point, the kind of Republican bet that people will get on board with authoritarianism that embraces a degree of aggression and violence, if the economy is bad enough, that isn't true yet. And I think that overall, one of the things it shows is that I think there's a suggestion here that Americans are kind of sick of the way politics has gone. I don't know if that's enough to mean anything, because the anger here doesn't come organically entirely. There's a degree of anger that's organic. Some people are always going to be angry at the government because the government's always going to get things wrong. People are always going to be angry at the systems that kind of govern their lives. But the way in which anger has become central to American politics is stoked heavily by a media machine, by a massive network of media that's grown up since the talk radio days of the early 90s. And this is today, like yesterday is evidence that machine has been worse at building an effective political coalition than we might have feared, but it still exists and it's still extremely profitable. And there's still millions and millions and millions of people who tune in and get angrier and angrier every day. And I think that the fact that maybe they're not going to continue to win elections the way they had been doesn't mean that they're not going to keep getting angrier, right? So I think there's, a lot of unanswered questions.
Can we just dig down a little bit then into the actual risk of violence? It does seem like there's a growing belief throughout the country that another civil war in the United States is plausible, even in the mainstream. A recent YouGov poll found that nearly 40% of Americans believe one is likely to break out within the next decade.
Yeah, and since I've been the guy who's been kind of beating this drum longer than most people, I started writing about this in 2015, 2016. I want to kind of, before we get deeper, clarify, when I talk about the possibility of a civil war or some sort of large-scale civil conflict in the United States, I'm not talking, North versus South, huge armies in the field, like massive set-piece battles, like, we tend to think about when we think about civil wars. I'm talking about a gradual increase, and then a sudden increase in the frequency of political violence, things like assassinations of media figures, of elected leaders, things like bombings of places that are kind of politically hot buttons. And that includes places that are like LGBT community centers, schools, that sort of thing. Attacks on voting precincts, leading to, regions of the country, areas, counties refusing federal control. And we have seen bits of this in Florida. The DeSantis refused to allow federal agents to observe elections. We've had a bunch of different sheriffs around the United States in many different states say that they're not going to be enforcing specific federal laws around things like gun control. Like, versions of this are already happening. So when I talk about like what I'm worried about, it's all of that accelerating to the point that supply chains start to break down, that you have, violence on a larger scale that is heavily politically motivated, and a substantial death toll, which would largely be as a result of like people starving, people not able to get access to medicine, the kind of things that happen when, you can't transport a truck down a highway without, a heavy risk of it being mined or bombed or something like that, or just, stopped by partisans. So that's what I talk about when I talk about like what I actually think is a risk. And where do I think it stands right now? Like I said, as we're seeing kind of in Florida and a number of other places, parts of that are in fact happening. It's worth noting that most of these voter intimidation attempts occur in deep red areas. So these are less, at the moment, these are less effective methods of trying to stop Democrats from voting in places where they might win, and more people in areas that are heavily red going after folks who they see as an ideological enemy in their midst and trying to intimidate them.
You say you've been talking, writing, speaking about this for quite some years now. So what made you begin to seriously consider the possibility?
Well, I mean, a big part of it was going to Iraq and reporting on the fighting against ISIS. And, the people I were embedded with were, for the most part, were Kurdish Peshmerga, which are not a military force in the traditional sense, but a militia that is owned and controlled by one of the major Kurdish political parties. And basically all of the entire Kurdish military force, which was so celebrated in the fighting against ISIS, and this is in Iraq, not in Syria, consisted of fighters from one of two political parties. And I started actually digging into how things worked in Iraq and how the way in which that quote unquote democracy functions. And a lot of it is sort of political parties that exert power and build influence by building armed wings and using them to both control society and distribute resources. And I kind of had the realization that like, well, that's not necessarily so far from possible here. There's elements of that you can see in the Bundy standoffs, in the constitutional sheriffs, which are sheriffs in a huge chunk of this country's rural population, who are refusing to enforce specific federal laws, and who have often used their sheriff's deputies in order to intimidate and harass people, to intimidate and harass activists, to intimidate and harass government officials attempting to enforce environmental regulations. You don't see anything that's as concentrated or thankfully yet as violent as what you see in the way these kind of structures work in Iraq, but the building blocks of it are in place.
That is really worrying. I spent a lot of time on the front line with the Peshmerga there.
Yeah.
And I spoke to the Minister of Defense as well. And I asked how the front line worked with such a divided army. As you say,
Yeah.
half and half, two ruling parties. And he said, we just split the front line into two. And they didn't plan, they didn't strategize with each other.
No.
And so you have these absurd stories coming from the foot soldiers, where one set of Peshmergas makes the gains, another loses it, somebody comes in. They're practically fighting each other in some cases. Just
literally in other cases.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're not the best of friends. There's that too.
Yeah.
But it makes for a dysfunctional country in many different fronts, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's this. I mean, not to say that Iraq and the United States are countries with very different histories. And it wasn't entirely based on that either. A lot of it was reporting from Ukraine starting in 2013 up through 2015, and reporting on kind of the very earliest stages of what we now call these kind of Russian influence operations, and seeing the degree to which particularly kind of the shotgunning of fake news into a populace had been successful in building kind of the space in kind of doubt in a lot of people, in particularly in the eastern part of the country, that provided some of the initial support for the separatists. And that kind of, there's a debate to be had about, because I know most people in Ukraine that I talk to call it an invasion, which is a perfectly fair term, but there was a decent degree of local support for the separatist movement, especially in the early days of it. And I think a lot of that, the space for that, and a lot of the nature of how muddled that conflict started out as, came because those disinformation operations had created so much anger, so much sort of such a divide between, the east and the west part of the country, which was a big part of, if you look into like what Paul Manafort was doing in Ukraine, right? This is kind of what those political technologists who were carrying out experiments in political manipulation that very much have kind of evolved into the campaigns that we see running all over the world today. So, all of that kind of fed into what I was thinking about when I was looking at the possibility of some sort of large scale civil conflict in the United States, because we have a history of feeling like we're insulated from everything that happens everywhere else in the world here. But we're not ever as much as we think we are. We're so deeply a part of everything that goes on around everywhere else that I kind of felt like the most arrogant thing I could do would be to pretend that these things I was seeing elsewhere in the world, and not just in Ukraine and Iraq, but in places like Myanmar, the most arrogant thing that I could do would be to assume that none of these things could ever happen in the United States.
So do you think it's broadly a good thing that more Americans are taking the prospect seriously?
Yes, I do. Because when I started writing about this, my goal was never to be like, you should start buying food and, you should start stockpiling weapons and get ready to fight a civil war. My goal was, well, this seems like it's a realistic threat. And, I reached out to people who were experts in their field, experts in counterinsurgency, experts in extremism. And they all kind of concurred with me that they felt like there was a threat of some serious surging in political violence at the very least, an open civil conflict at the worst. And I felt like the responsible thing to do is, well, maybe if you can get people to take that seriously as a threat, they will not just vote, but they will start to act in a way as if that's a threat, and that will make the threat less likely. So I think that it's good that people are taking this seriously. I think it's important to know what the stakes are. The worst thing you can do is assume this terrible thing could never happen here because we're somehow special.
But do you think it could possibly be quite a dangerous thing as well? I mean, we had Joseph Burton, a former American diplomat to Turkey, on the podcast the other day, and he mentioned that he was becoming concerned about the growing enthusiasm of American liberals for the use of state power against their political opponents. And he compared it to the attitudes of secular Kemalists in Turkey, who have long embraced the use of military force against Islamist politicians. So even though there's clearly more appetite for anti-democratic violence on the right, of course, is that something you're concerned about as well?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I'm not a fan of the use of state power in most situations, but certainly not to harm people. I think it's a difficult balance to strike, because one thing history teaches us about authoritarian movements is that when they try to take over the government, and in democracy, if you give them a slap on the wrist, then they come back and succeed, right? Like this is actually a fairly durable. You can go back to Napoleon III in France to look at like cases of this happening, and obviously the Munich beer hall putsch is kind of the more common historical reference point. But this is a pretty durable lesson. So I do believe that when a group of people attempts to end a democracy through violence, you kind of have to throw down, right? You can't just be like, well, they didn't do it, so let's pretend it wasn't a big deal. At the same time, the worst thing that we could do, in my opinion, as a response to January 6th and as a response to this other stuff happening, is massively expand the power of our police agencies, is throw more money and power at the FBI, is pass new laws and new, executive acts that are sort of expanding the ability of intelligence agencies to surveil Americans. Number one, we tried all that after 9/11 and none of it worked. And number two, all of these organizations are fundamentally more aligned with the right wing. And so pumping more money into them in the hopes that they will stop an insurgent right is probably going to wind up coming back on you. You can look at how many dozens of police officers took part in the January 6th attempt at a coup. You can look at stuff like the individual who placed the bombs at the DNC and the RNC the night before January 6th, who still has not been caught by the FBI, who I would say, if you were asking what the smart money is, has some sort of background in intelligence, because that individual knew how to dress and how not to dress. They knew where the cameras were. They knew exactly what they were doing. And I'd be willing to bet you they were states away by the time the riot started at the Capitol. I think it's when we talk about fighting back against the things that scare us by arming a group of a third party, who are effectively accountable only to themselves. And that's true of basically every law enforcement agency. That's a deeply worrying thing. So I think that the thing that I always try to encourage is like community and individual resistance to authoritarianism, and resistance to the people who want to make our society more politically violent than it is, rather than attempting to have an institution clamp down on growing violence. Because I don't think they're very good at that. I don't think they've proven to be very good at that. But I do think that when communities reject that sort of behavior, that does tend to be effective. It's the lesson that most countries who have carried out insurgent operations fail to learn, which is that, it's the thing everyone talks about, right? You got to win hearts and minds. What that actually means is, if you want to deny a violent insurgent territory, you can't just kill them all, right? Because you never will. And in the act of killing as many of them as you can, you'll create more. What you can do is, or what ought to be done, is build space within civil society that is resistant to those movements. And I think that's the way I kind of look at it here. And I don't think that has anything to do with wielding state power against these people, because to some extent, I don't think state power can be wielded very effectively against the right in the United States.
Well, then maybe the question really is, how did the country actually get to this point? How did Americans come to hate each other so much that they are willing to even entertain the notion that they might have to kill each other in the next 10 years?
Well, the first thing to understand is that this is not abnormal behavior for Americans. For one thing, we already fought a civil war that killed like 1 million people, Americans do have a pretty long, proud tradition of murdering each other over politics. This existed prior to the Civil War. You can look at stuff like Bleeding Kansas, John Brown's rebellion. And this existed after the Civil War. You can look at all of the violence that rushed through the United States in the post-Reconstruction era. You can look at the Red Summer of 1918. You can look at the violence that accompanied the Civil Rights Movement. Political violence is far from unprecedented in the United States. In fact, it's fairly normal. What is different is the way in which political violence spreads and is inspired algorithmically through the use of the media by bad actors. That is kind of the novel dimension of what we're seeing. And it's part of why the scale is so much wider than it used to be. Because of the internet, this happens at a much wider geographical spread, and it's much harder to predict. Last night, while the elections, the polls were still open, some Telegram channels that are used by the right started circulating threats of a mass shooting, that there was going to be a shooting in the specific Portland neighborhood near some voting precincts. And like people who lived there kept asking me, is this a real threat? And what I had to say is like, there's no way to know. This stuff pops up all the time before stuff that doesn't happen. So you have to kind of, if you're trying to analyze how likely violence is in an instance, it's not just the presence of threats. You have to kind of get wonkier about it and try to analyze like how dense the threats are, right? Like myself and a number of people published articles before January 6th warning that something like that was going to happen. And the reason why we felt confident doing that is there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people talking about doing it, right? As opposed to one or two. But that's also that's so new. And it's something that clearly, because January 6th happened, I think it's very fair to say the law enforcement has not caught up to. And I think to a significant extent, neither have journalists or broader society.
Robert Evans, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
This has been The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. You can find Robert on Twitter at IWriteOK and listen to his podcasts It Could Happen Here and Behind the Bastards on your favourite podcast app. You can also find his essay How Portland Stopped the Proud Boys on our website, newlinesmag.com. This week's episode was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Lydia Wilson. Thank you all for joining us.